An harrowing video coming out of Kabul, Afghanistan after the government which the United States propped up in the last 20 years following the global war on terror after 9/11 has crumbled without much resistance at all. The most terrible video to watch has definitely been coming out of the Kabul Airport as thousands of people attempt to get onto planes which are leaving the country. These thousands of people, we believe, were the ones who helped the Americans in the last 20 years, serving as interpreters, as cooks, doing any number of jobs for the Western Alliance, which was in the country for the majority of my life. And initially watching these videos last night after the fall of Afghanistan's capital city and after the Afghan president fled the country via airplane, I was appalled, thinking, how could we let this happen? And I think that it's hard, if you have any level of humanity, not to feel these things when you're watching these people who you know will die should they be left to the mercy of the Afghan government. However, I was happy when Joe Biden announced that we were getting out of Afghanistan. I was happy when Donald Trump ran on getting us out of Afghanistan. And I gave Joe Biden a lot of credit for actually having the courage to do what none of the last four presidents have had the courage to do. And I think that my reasons for supporting this are far more well articulated by Ron Paul, who wrote about this in a column on his website. And so I'm going to read you some of that. I'm reading it republished on Fitz News because Ron Paul's website has gone down, probably because of a lot of traffic coming out of the popularity of this column. This weekend, the U.S. experienced another Saigon moment, this time in Afghanistan. After a 20-year war that drained trillions from Americans' pockets, the capital of Afghanistan fell without a fight. The corrupt Potemkin regime that the U.S. had been propping up for 2 decades and the Afghan military that we had spent billions training had melted away. The rush is on now to find somebody to blame for the chaos in Afghanistan. Many of the experts doing the finger-pointing are the ones who are the most to blame. Politicians and pundits who played cheerleaders for this war for 2 decades are now rushing to blame President Biden for finally getting the U.S. out. Where were they when succeeding presidents continued to add troops and expand the mission in Afghanistan? The U.S. war on Afghanistan was not lost yesterday in Kabul. It was lost the moment it shifted from a limited mission to apprehend those who planned the attack on 9/11 to an exercise in regime change and in nation building. This is a lesson that we obviously should have learned from Vietnam. Immediately after the 9/11 attacks, I proposed that we issue letters of marque and reprisal to bring those responsible to justice, but such a limited and targeted response to the attack was ridiculed at the time. How could the U.S. war machine and its allied profiteers make their billions if we didn't put on a massive war, says Ron Paul. So who is to blame for the scenes from Afghanistan this weekend? There's plenty to go around. Congress has kicked the can down the road for 20 years, continuing to fund the Afghan war long after even they understood that there was no point to the U.S. occupation. Obviously, this is Ron Paul's opinion. Others could argue that there is a point to that occupation. One, for the human rights violations that the Taliban occupation is sure to bring in Afghanistan. 2, for the resurgence of al-Qaeda that is sure to happen now that the Taliban are in charge. Going back to Dr. Paul, there were some efforts by members to end the war, but most, on a bipartisan basis, just went along to get along. The generals and other high-ranking military officers lied to their commander-in-chief and to the American people for years about progress in Afghanistan. The same is true for the U.S. intelligence agencies. Unless there is a major purge of those who lied and misled, we can count on these disasters to continue until the last U.S. dollar goes up in smoke. The military-industrial complex spent 20 years on the gravy train with the Afghanistan war. They built missiles, they built tanks, they built aircraft and helicopters. They hired armies of lobbyists and think tank writers to continue the lie that was making them rich. They wrapped their graft up in the American flag. But they're the opposite of patriots. The mainstream media has uncritically repeated the propaganda of the military and political leaders about Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and all the other pointless U.S. interventions. Many of these outlets are owned by defense industry-connected companies. The corruption is deep. American citizens must also share some blame. Until more Americans rise up and demand a pro-America, non-interventionist foreign policy, they will continue to get fleeced by war profiteers. Political control in Afghanistan has returned to the people who fought against those they perceived as occupiers and for what they viewed as their homeland. This is the real lesson, but don't expect it to be understood in Washington. War is too profitable, and political leaders are too cowardly to go against the tide. But the lesson is clear for anyone wishing to see it. The U.S. global military empire is a grave threat to the United States and its future. Now, it would be unwise to go so far as Ron Paul has went in saying that there are no points to any of our interventions in Syria, in Afghanistan, since he himself said that it would make sense in the wake of 9/11 to go in and use scalpel-like precision to remove those al-Qaeda elements that were the direct factors that led to 9/11 happening. I think that if we use our military to that kind of effect, largely with special operations in various parts of the world to eliminate people who are threats to life and liberty in the Western world, in the United States in particular, it would be wise to do that on a broad scope. However, propping up governments that clearly are not there with the will of the people is not something that I think that we should support. And I know that many Republicans who supported President Trump saying that he was going to get us out of Afghanistan, many Republicans that were on his bandwagon of wanting to end endless wars will come after Joe Biden. And they should come after Joe Biden for not having executed this well. However, you will also see some defend the underlying policy that we should have perpetually propped up the regime in Afghanistan. And this is where I agree with Dr. Paul in that this is not something that we should do. Obviously, this is an issue like the Vietnam War that will be discussed for decades to come. And who knows, maybe in 10 years, who knows, maybe in 3 years, who knows, maybe in 6 months, Al-Qaeda will resurge, and we will say that this was the worst mistake that we ever made. But on a policy level, I think that endless wars and occupations that result in propping up governments that should not naturally exist are not in the best interest of the United States. And while I probably won't agree with Joe Biden on many of his other policy decisions for the rest of his presidency, I'd like to give him credit for this one.